I know there's a God. I recognize that that's a fairly controversial statement, and that there's a good chance that you listening right now don't agree with it. Well, we want to talk about it. Hello and welcome to the Gospel Call podcast, brought to you by the Percival Church of Christ. When we hear a statement like, I know there is a God, there are certain things that are implied. And specifically, we want to look at the earlier part of the statement. The there is a God half is important, certainly, and we'll be talking about that in later podcasts. But it's equally important to understand the part where we say, I know. When you say something like, I know there is a God, you're going to find a lot of people disagree with you for a lot of different reasons. Of course, any atheist is going to disagree on the part where it says, there is a God. The agnostic, that would be somebody who believes we can't know whether or not there is a God, is not going to have so much trouble with the there is a God half, but rather they're going to be more concerned with the I know half. It would be the assertion of the agnostic that we cannot know whether or not there is a God. So before we get into our studies of the affirmative arguments for the existence of God, I suppose it's more important that we first study what can we know. There's a term for the substudy of philosophy of what can we know in general called epistemology. And that's what we're going to be looking at right now. The epistemology of the God question in general. Can we know whether or not there is a God? Is it possible that somebody right now knows with certainty that there is no God? Let's start with that idea. Is it possible to know whether or not there is no God? Before we get into this, I'd like to take a second and define a couple of things that might have unusual definitions, but in our philosophical context here, they're worth defining. Namely, proof and evidence. Now, normally evidence in particular may have some different definitions, but how we are going to define evidence is something that suggests a conclusion, but does not necessarily demand the conclusion. And then when we talk about proof, that is going to be something that demands a conclusion. So to give you an example about the difference, at least in our discussions, between evidence and proof, imagine that you have a young child and that one day you look in your freezer and see that all of your ice cream is missing. Your young child then comes up to you and you can see that they have ice cream all over their face. This would be an indicator of evidence. This strongly suggests that your ice cream is missing because your child ate it. But it's not the only possible solution. Perhaps you first see them come in and what you assume is ice cream might actually be mud. They fell in playing in the mud. Perhaps it is something else that they were eating that got all over their face. Or perhaps a neighbor gave them some ice cream. Now, all of these solutions are less likely, certainly. And through common sense, we can probably determine that the evidence points to a certain conclusion. But it's not quite proof. Proof would be when the conclusion is demanded, when there is no other possible explanation. So, if you happen to have a surveillance camera in your kitchen, and you have video footage of the child opening up the freezer at the right time, getting the last of the ice cream and eating it all, that would be proof. So when we talk about proof and evidence from here on out, know that evidence is probably going to suggest a certain conclusion, but not necessarily demand it, whereas proof will always demand the conclusion. Okay, back to epistemology. When we look at a statement like, I know there is no God, we are hearing a statement that affirms a universal negative. You may have heard it said that it is impossible to prove a negative. Well, that's not entirely true. What do we mean when we say a negative? It's just a no statement. A statement that is claiming that something does not exist or that something did not happen. So somebody may say it's impossible to prove a negative. Well, that's not entirely true. You can prove a negative if you can observe the entirety of what the negative is supposedly affecting. For example, if I were to say there is no cell phone in my hand, we'll say my left hand, I can prove that statement by showing you my left hand. You could come here, supposedly if you're in the office with me, and look at my palm and search it. And since it's a small search area, it wouldn't be hard to find out that indeed there was no phone within my left hand. That's a provable negative. When we say that you cannot prove a universal negative, we mean that there is a larger space to be observed when we say that you cannot prove a universal negative. So let's expand the space where we're searching from. Instead of my hand, let's say my office. Now, if someone were to say, I know there is no cell phone in my office, they would be wrong. There's a cell phone in my pocket. There's a cell phone, old broken one I have in the closet over here. So there's a couple cell phones. But even if we were to remove those two cell phones that I'm aware of, I still wouldn't be able to conclusively prove that there is no cell phone within my office. Why? Because I have not observed the entire office thoroughly enough to know whether or not there is a phone. Now, I suppose, theoretically, it would be possible for someone to search the office so thoroughly that they could conclusively say, there is no phone in this office, but it would take a while, wouldn't it? And it's not just because you think you know what's in the office. Right now, I'm working from home. I don't know if it's possible that my wife, for whatever reason, may have dropped her phone in this room. And if I were to make the statement, I know there is no cell phone besides the two that I'm already aware of in this office, it really wouldn't be accurate because I couldn't be sure if there wasn't another one somewhere. Let's expand the range a little bit. The classic example that I've heard a couple of times regarding this is the idea of a mouse on an island. Let's say theoretically that you and a friend are placed on a remote island somewhere, and each of you is given a task. Your friend is given the task to prove conclusively that there is no mouse anywhere on the island. You are given the task to prove that there is a mouse somewhere on the island. Who has the easier task? Well, it depends entirely upon whether or not there are any mice on the island. If there is a mouse on the island, then his task is impossible, and your task is doable. It might take you a while to find some sort of proof of the mouse, but eventually, presumably if you're trying hard enough, you would find proof of the mouse. Where this gets interesting is if the situations are reversed. If there is no mouse on the island, yes, you have an impossible task, but your friend still has a nearly impossible task. Because in order to conclusively prove that there is no mouse on the island, then they would have to search the entire island. Leave no stone unturned. Any place that was big enough to have a mouse in it, they would have to look. They have another couple of problems on top of that, because there might be some places where they wouldn't be able to access that a mouse would. Or there might be a single mouse on the island, and they might check one place, and the mouse might move, so they could check every place on the island, but then they wouldn't know for sure that the mouse just hadn't moved somewhere else. And so you have a nearly identically impossible task. This is what we mean when we say you can't prove a universal negative. Let's expand our little mouse island to the entire universe. Could you imagine the ridiculousness of somebody trying to claim that there is no mouse anywhere in the universe at all? In order to make that statement conclusively, they would have to search everywhere in the universe a mouse could possibly be. Now, if you've been thinking really hard about this, you might have found an exception to this rule already, and we're going to get to that in one moment. But before we do, let's expand our little problem one more time. We've expanded from proving that there's no cell phone in my hand to proving that there's no cell phone in my office to proving that there's no mouse on an island to proving that there's no mouse in the entire universe. Let's add one more problem on top of that. Let's say that the object that we are trying to find is not so easy to observe as a phone or a mouse. In fact, it is something that is impossible to observe because it is not physical, and indeed does not reside within our physical universe. We've expanded our potential reach of search area to a limit which we can't fully comprehend. So when somebody makes a statement that there is no God, then we've made a statement similar to saying there's no mouse anywhere in the universe. It's similar, but the there is no God statement actually makes less sense, because God cannot be observed in our physical universe. He is spiritual in nature. Now, I did mention that there was an exception to the rule. There was one time where you can prove a universal negative. We don't talk about it all that much, but you can prove a universal negative if it is irrational. Back to the mouse problem from before, when I mentioned that it would be absurd for somebody to say there is no mouse anywhere in the universe, you may have thought to yourself, well, we sort of do that every once in a while because sometimes we declare not mice, but other species of animals extinct. And therefore we are claiming that nowhere within the universe are there any of these species of animals. And yes, we can be decently confident that these animals are no longer around. But here's why there's an important difference between proof and evidence. When we declare a species extinct, it is based on strong evidence that there are no more of this species anywhere on Earth and by extension anywhere in the universe. But it's technically not based on proof. And if you want a great example of what the difference for our discussion between proof and evidence is, sometimes species are declared extinct, and then it turns out there's still a couple of them left and we just didn't realize it. So declaring a species extinct does not prove that it is non-existent. The one time you can actually prove a universal negative is when it is irrational. So for example, I can say with confidence that there is no square circle anywhere in the universe, even though I have not observed the entire universe to know positively that there are no square circles there. I know by the definition of a square and a circle that they are completely incompatible, and therefore nowhere in the universe is there a square circle. A couple of you smart Alecs out there might try to email me a picture of a circle within a square or some other clever solution to this problem, but we know that actually isn't a square circle, it's just a circle within a square. Nowhere in the universe is there a square circle because by the definition of square and by the definition of circle, they cannot be compatible. So the only time you can make the claim that you know something does not exist in the universe is if its very existence is illogical. What does all this have to do with God? The two worldviews that we talked about before, the atheistic and agnostic worldview, both claim universal negatives. The atheistic worldview claims that there is no God. And at first it might not seem like the agnostic worldview makes a claim, but it does. It makes the claim that we cannot know whether or not there is a God. That means that anywhere within the universe, there is no place in which we can find proof that there is a God. Both claims fall to the same problem. You cannot prove a universal negative. When I say, I know there is a God, I am not claiming a universal negative. I am claiming something that can be proven. I'm claiming that something is true. Now, we mentioned previously the differences between evidence and proof. Part of the nature of proof is that it doesn't require much to be convincing. If, for example, you had a whole mountain's worth of evidence versus just one little piece of proof, one proof, it doesn't really matter what the evidence suggests. The proof always wins out. Thinking of our ice cream topic earlier, imagine you had two children, and you have one child who has the ice cream all over their face, and although the evidence strongly suggests one conclusion, if you look at your security footage of your refrigerator, I don't know why you have a security camera pointed at your refrigerator, but let's say you did. And you look and you see that it's actually the other child who took the ice cream. The amount of evidence doesn't matter because you have the one proof necessary. The same thing goes for God. If we have but one proof that concludes that there is a God, then we can know with certainty that there indeed is a God. In our next few episodes, we're going to go over that proof, and we do not have only one proof, although we only need one. But, as it happens, we have three. I hope you join us next time on the Gospel Call when we begin to talk about these proofs for the existence of God. My name is DJ Kessinger, and thank you so much for listening.